Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video in which we'll talk about global exception handling in an ASP.NET Core API. And as you might already know, there are actually two ways in which we could handle exceptions globally in ASP.NET Core. One way is to use a global exception handling middleware that kind of like would help us with the exception handling. And then we could also have an exception filter. And I have created already a video about filters on ASP.NET Core, and I will leave a link to this video in the description of this one. If you have time or if you want, or if you are curious about filters in general, you should definitely check that out. And the question that I always get is, what would be the best way to actually go about exception handling or global exception handling in ASP.NET Core? Should we use a middleware or should we use a filter for that? And as I always say, actually, or in most cases in programming, the answer is it depends. It depends what you want to achieve. Therefore, in this video, I would like to go through both of the approaches and actually look a little bit at what's actually the real difference between them and try to understand the pros and cons for each of the strategies, or what we have at our disposal, for instance, if we handle it in middleware, what we have at our disposal if we handle it in a filter. So we want to take a practical look at this and understand exactly then what would be some scenarios in which you might want to do it in a filter, or scenarios in which you might want to do it in the middleware. So let's get first started. I have here a very simple API, but as I always like to do, I have structured it in a layered way. In this case, we have a domain layer here. It's a weather forecast, just like the regular template. And we have then a data access layer in which we actually have this repository that returns us the weather forecasts. And we have in this application layer the services and the forecast service that we kind of like use for this purpose. And then of course we have this API, and in this API I have controllers. And in the controllers, what I'm doing here is actually I am just throwing an exception, and as I mentioned here, I'm throwing it just for fun so that we can have something to discuss about in this video. But before we get really started, let's see first of all the behavior and what we get. For instance, if we run this application right now, and if we make a request here, and let me bring this to the other window so that you can also see it. Let me make a get, let me try it out, execute, and what you see here is we get kind of like the entire error here with the stack trace, with everything. And this is of course not very good to do. So instead, what we usually want to achieve in APIs is that we want to have an error contract that we return whenever we might encounter some errors. So if you go and check out the documentation of, I don't know, very popular APIs like the Spotify API or something similar, you will always see that when a certain resource or a certain request for a resource has an error, you get actually a very specific error response that has the same structure no matter what request you send. The payload data might differ exactly depending on the resource that you have created, but the structure of the error response is actually always the same. And that's because APIs, as also the name implies, are contracts, are programming interfaces. So when we define what we return, consumers actually rely on that information. So for instance, I have here a contract, like whenever I want to return an error, I just want to have here a status code and I want to have a message, but I don't want to have the stack trace. Of course, you can enlarge this type of error contract, providing also maybe timestamps on when the error exactly occurred, maybe providing some information about the resource that was requested. So that's really up to you to decide exactly what your business or what your use case is and what information you would like to display actually in your errors, as long as they are consistent and you get the same structured error messages no matter what resource actually do you request, or the client's request. And it's clearly in our case, at least so far, that was actually not possible. So in order to achieve this and make sure that we always return a certain error response with the same structure, and of course in JSON format, because our API here is responding in JSON, so we have to stick to this even if we are returning errors, we have, as said, two different strategies or two different possibilities. So first of all, we can use a middleware. And if we look into this, I have here created a custom middleware for exception handling purposes. Now, in this middleware, there's really nothing very specific going on. The only thing is that we wrap this await.next in this try catch, and here we have this catch exception. And here what we actually do, we set the appropriate response headers because we want to return an error, and then we create this body and we write this to the body, and we have an override of the toString for our error response so that it returns a JSON serialized string when we call the toString method. So that's actually everything that we do. But of course you can get fancier with this API, because here you can catch different type of exceptions, like your very own domain or application specific exceptions. You can catch them here and maybe write different messages in the message part of the error, depending on what type of error do you have. So you can get really fancy with this. But if you want to have a video only on exception handling middleware, because there are a lot or there are some caveats or things that might need to be discussed in more depth, just let me or leave me a comment here to this video, and if I see that there is really interest for a video dedicated only to exception handling middleware, then I will certainly create one. But for now, I guess we should be good to go. And if we go in the program.cs class, where is it? Where is it? Here it is, of course. And I have commented out this app use exception middleware. That's what I was using previously. Now, if we run the application, we'll see that hopefully, of course, our response will be much different in this time. So let's just wait to run this. It shouldn't really take long. Of course, here it is. So let me bring it as usual to the other screen, but maybe we don't really need to enlarge this. Let's say this get, try it out, execute, and we should be able to see the response. And voila, here in this case, we have a very nice JSON formatted response that contains exactly the error response model that we have defined in our contracts, and we are okay with this. So we can close this application right now and everything seems to be fine. Cool. Now, this was the way that we have used with this exception handling middleware. Now, let me first of all walk you through this other part with the filter. But in order to use the filter, we will actually have to add something here in the configuration, because I already have an exception filter, and I will show you this exception filter just in a few seconds. And I would like to add my exception filter globally. So this is why in this builder services add controllers, here we can take in a configuration object, and here we can say configuration filters add, and I want to add my exception filter to this. And what this means from a filter perspective is that right now this filter is applied globally. So for each request, no matter to which resources, this filter will be applied. And if we have an exception, then this filter should handle the exception. Now let's take a look into this filter. And we see here that filter, we just have to implement this exception filter. And here in this on exception, we actually do something similar to what we have done in our middleware, but here in this case we just create this error message, and then we set the result with a JSON result of error and the status code 500, because that's what we actually want to return. And in fact, we have set here things a little bit differently than in the middleware, and actually that's one of the explanations on why or what's the difference between a filter or a global exception filter or a global exception handling middleware. But let's first of all run the application and ensure that we have actually the exact same result. And then we'll go a little bit deeper into analyzing how these two different strategies or possibilities to handle exception actually work. So we have this weather forecast. Let's click here on this get. We want to try it out and we execute it and we get the same thing here. So we got the same error message. Like previously, but right now we are using this exception filter and not the middleware. Cool. Now, let's see what's actually different between an exception handling middleware and a filter. And to do that, I would like to come back actually to this whiteboard or blackboard representation that we have used in the previous video, in which we talked generally about what filters are in ASP.NET Core. Because this would actually also give you a first-hand idea on why actually the exception handling middleware, or how exactly the exception handling middleware and the filters are differently. And if we take a look here, what we have in this upper part, that's actually the middleware pipeline. And usually you would place an exception handling middleware as the first middleware here in the pipeline, because that would be also the last through which the response would go through. So if we have an error, we can just handle that. So the exception, if you try to think visually, the exception handling middleware would be actually here. Now, if we use a filter, we have to go deeper down the pipeline. And we said that when we talk about filters, after the routing middleware, we get into the action execution pipeline. And the exception filter, as you can see here, is part of this action execution pipeline, and it happens right after the action filter. So you see that actually from this spot, actually, where we have the exception handling middleware till this spot, there are quite different things that still can happen, and we are conceptually in two different parts of the request processing. So here for the middleware, we are in the middleware request pipeline, and here we are in the action execution pipeline. Cool. Now, what does this actually mean for us from a practical perspective? Now, from a practical perspective, it actually means that if we go to the middleware, where is the middleware? This is the middleware, cool. So if we go to the middleware, traditionally, if we are in a middleware, we have access to this HTTP context. And this means that we can do whatever we want right now with this HTTP context. Now, of course, there might be some caveats about this, but as said, this is something maybe for a different video. Now, the idea is that here what we can do is basically only stuff that we can do on an HTTP context. Of course, we could add some of our custom logic to, I don't know, maybe log the exceptions, do whatever we want with them. But in the end, when we generate a response, we can just set properties or headers or values to the HTTP context. And in processing that, exception, we can only rely on information that we have actually in the HTTP context. We can't really rely on any other type of information. So this is what we have in the HTTP context. Okay, cool. Now let's go to the filter. The filter, as we have seen, is part of the execution of the action execution pipeline. And this means that here there is a different set of things or properties or information or state, call it whatever you want, that we have access to. For instance, let me just go here down a little bit. Okay, let's also stop the application from running. That doesn't really help. And you see that we have here this exception context that's injected in this kind of like method by ASP.NET Core. So we don't have to care about it. Now, if we look a little bit at the context, we see that here we have a lot of additional information that maybe we don't have in the HTTP context. So first of all, we have access to the exception itself. So we can have here access to really everything that's related to the exception. The data, the message, the source, the inner exception, if we have one, a stack trace, a target site, and everything. Basically, that's the exception itself. It's the exception class. So that's one thing that we have access to. Then from this exception context, we also have access to the iAction result. So this is, for instance, where we can set the iAction result. And that's in fact what we are doing right at the end, where we set the result with a JSON result and we specify the body. So we have access to this result, which is very, very important. But then, for instance, we have this exception handled, which is kind of like a flag if the exception is handled or not. But then we have, for instance, also access to the different filter information. So do we have other filters down the pipeline? So there might be some information from other filters that you might want to check while processing this exception. Then you have, for instance, this action descriptor. And if we look in this action descriptor, that's actually quite nice. And that's one very important thing that I think it might be, well, definitely a plus to use global exception handling in filters, because here, for instance, you have access to the entire action that was actually triggered. You have access to all the parameters of the action, the properties, the constraints, the display name that's not maybe important, but filter descriptors, then routed value. So the values actually that were part of this route. So there are really a lot of things that you have here on this action descriptor that you actually might want to use when you handle your exception, maybe when you are customizing the message that you want to return to your consumers. And of course, we have also access to the HTTP context. So if we want actually to use or get some information or set some information, maybe in the HTTP context, we can do that. But then we have also the model state. So we have also information about the model state, and maybe the exception was thrown because the model state was not valid, or that there were problems in the model state. So that's really a vital part of information that might be important when processing or when creating your exception message. But then we also have route data. And in route data, for instance, you can have here, for instance, different routers that you can check to see exactly, okay, what happened. You can clear that. So you have information about the routing that occurred actually when this exception was thrown. You have here access to this different type of values, where you can get the keys for each route data. You have a key and a value. So you see the keys, you see the values. You have really access to everything that was concerning, or that ASP.NET Core has actually created in order for us to be able to execute that action. And all this type of information, okay, here maybe I just deleted a little bit too long. So all this type of information you actually don't have access to in the middleware. So if you go in the middleware, we'll see that, yeah, we just have the access to the HTTP context and information about, hey, what did we can get from the context. So let's see here, context, for instance, context, and yeah, we have the connection, the features, really everything that we have on the HTTP context, like if the user is authenticated. But as we see, we still have access to the HTTP context also in the filter. So all this data we can gather also, or we can use also in the filter. But the action execution data we cannot actually use here in our global exception handling middleware. So this is actually the main difference on handling things or handling exception globally in a middleware compared to handling exception globally in a filter. And here what I can tell you is that there is not really a best way or a perfect way to do it. It kind of like depends on what you need to achieve. My personal preference is though to actually use an exception filter for global exception handling, because I have access to a lot more information than in a regular exception handling middleware. So that's actually the main point why I would like to do that. Now, of course, there might be also some different exception handling strategies that, by the way, if you actually are interested in this topic and would like a video on exception handling strategies in layered ASP.NET Core applications, also just leave a comment and let me know. And if there is enough interest, we'll certainly do a video on that one, because there are some very important or some nice things or strategies to consider, or at least to have a thought about whenever we actually want to create a new application. Okay, cool. But mostly that's what I wanted to show you in this video. And well, this is what I wanted to actually tell you and my personal preference. But as very often happens in programming, there is really no definite answer if you should do this in a middleware or if you should do this in the filter. The main or the important thing is that you are aware of the differences that we have when doing it in a middleware and when doing it in a filter. Because when you know this type of differences, when you have to kind of like take a decision, you can take an informed decision, and you can take and you can say, hey, I would like to use this. I would like to use a middleware as a global exception handling strategy, and that's perfectly fine, as long as you are aware that, hey, maybe there is some more information on the action execution context, but I don't really care about that information when I am generating my errors, and I want, for instance, my exception handling to be as close as possible to the entry point in the application or to the exit point of the application when we think about the response. So you can definitely choose that, and it's okay. But also you can say, hey, I think it might be useful to have access also to all the action executing context information. So in that case, I would like maybe to use filters or a global exception filter for global exception handling. And that's also perfectly fine. There's no problem with that. This being said, thank you very, very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you think it might be useful, don't be shy and share it with your colleagues, with your peers. I don't know, maybe through emails, social networks, forums, wherever you think that there might be people that might be interested and find this information useful. Share it, and I would totally appreciate that. And of course, if you didn't subscribe to the Code Wrinkles channel, please do subscribe, hitting the subscribe button, but also using the notification bell to be always informed when we post some new content here. Well, and last but not least, of course, if you have anything that you want to add or questions that you have to ask, also don't be shy and hit the comment section and leave your comment, and I would be more than happy to get a discussion going. This being said, once again, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.